The title of this talk is of 8 billion people, how many are on Ukraine's side? Now, without doing the math very carefully, I think it is fair to say that by most accounts, a majority of the world's population lives in countries in which the government is not actively supporting Ukraine, is not enforcing sanctions and such. That I phrased it that way because that's I think the most accurate way to put it. It is not that the people are not supporting Ukraine, it is that they live in governments where the government is not actively enforcing sanctions and such. So that what I'm going to try to do, and this is in a way a continuation of the panel that Zanny Minton-Beddoes and Mike were on, is really get down. This is in some ways the heart of the challenge on the non-military side for Ukraine, because you will not be able to enforce any kind of economic pressure on Russia if Russia can just buy the thing that you banned them from buying from South Africa or from Brazil or from India. And so, you know, you can say that the Americans can't sell to Russia and the Americans won't sell to Russia, but they'll sell to South Africa, and then the South Africans sell to Russia. So how do you think of this in a more creative way? How to approach this? This is what we're going to try and tackle very concretely. I want to start with Oleksandr because you're the deputy chairman of the parliament and you have taken a special interest in this. You've been tasked with trying to talk to some of these countries. Give us a sense from your point of view. What have you learned that is interesting and that will inform this question?
Thank you very much for it. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start from some maybe more wide thing about this non-Western country. Let's name them not Global South, because it's not only about South. It's about Middle East. It's not Global South. If you talk about the classic formulation, what is Global South, it's not rich country. Okay, Middle East, it's rich countries. India, it's rich country. And South Africa also. Let's talk about not Western world. It will be more correct. Okay. What I see the main problem in this case for us, for all of us, for Western world, it understanding that most amount of that country are not democracy. It's something hybrid. It's something authoritarian. If we talk about African countries, it's very different way to manage country. We can talk about military authoritarian, about non-military authoritarian, about some election democracy, with parliament, about some election democracy without parliament. It's very different kinds of how this country is managed by. That's why our traditional way to work with voters, to work with people, how we work in Western world, in some cases will not work. We need to work and with society, with people, for one side. For other side, we need to work with elites, because if we talk about African continent, we need to understand that for 30, 40, 80, I don't know, 60, maybe the long 50 years, some elites manage some country. It's a very long way. And people of this country, population of this country can do anything. We need to work with country who need to help us, because most of this country are not able to be active in economical reasons. They need support from other countries. It's an issue of China, of course, because it's one of the most influenced countries to Africa continent. We need to understand it, etc., etc. What I can tell about our work for last year, of course, from the start of full-scale invasion, from 21st of February, from the first voting in UN Assembly, it was like a wet blanket for us, because let me be clear, we did expect so huge level of abstention. For us, for Ukrainians, it was very clear situation. Russia, aggressor, we win violence, awful massacres in Bucha, etc., etc. And at that time, we see that about 40 countries say we abstain or leave the room. It's the same like abstain, but more kind. And of course, it was time to start to rethinking about this strategy. And what we see the first, we look to our position, for example, in Africa. And of course, we understand why African country abstained. Because we haven't embassies in Africa. We haven't any communication in Africa. In previous 30 years, our diplomacy strategy was about Western world, was about our Western partners, was about Euro integration, etc., but not about non-Western countries. Of course, we try to fix it. When we start to communicate with non-Western world, we recognize it that, of course, this country are more trust deeds, not words. And of course, it was challenge, because in time of full-scale invasion, in time of decreasing economy, GDP, etc., Ukrainian couldn't give something to them. We could give only our words, only our open hearts, only our willing, only our dialogue, and only our contact, and we start to do that. But when we added to our contact, to our dialogue, something practical, like initiative Grain from Ukraine. When we asked Western countries to charity some, not big amount, but some amount of money, to collect Ukrainian grain and to send it to MOPU country, to Djibouti, to Somalia, to etc. And it started to work to build this trust between us and African continent, because it was example of practical helping. When we met with colleagues from African country, I personally met with more than 60 different countries from non-Western world. Especially, I had 30 meetings with my level vis-a-vis, like head of parliament or vice president of parliament from Africa, non-Western world. On this meeting, we had discussion about very practical things. For example, I will not say what the country it was from African continent, but one of my vis-a-vis asked me for support them practically in terms of agriculture. They asked me to send agriculture vessel to their country. They asked me, can you, like speaker of parliament, like vice president, send our dozen vessels? We need it, because we need vessel to take our agriculture. It's very interesting for us in Western world, because we all time speak about some values, about our some height levels thing, but not about vessels. But it's true, it's practical. And of course, I want to add last remark about why approach of president administration, Zelensky and Yermak, Andriy, about promoting peace formula, why it's so effective. Because one of our conclusion from interparliamentary working with non-Western world was about that we need some very practical and very precision explanation of our all steps. In this kind, peace formula of Zelensky, brilliant. because we have 10 steps, and we have very understandable way to promote it. As President Zelensky yesterday said, if you don't want to support us military, you can support us children deportation case. And our Arabian world friends started to do that. And it became very effective. If you don't want to give us money, or you don't have, in terms of most of non-Western world, it will be we don't have, it not will be we don't want. You can support us by some humanitarian aid or by your position. Last example, very interesting, with Alena Shkrum, with Lesia, with other colleagues, we worked hard on Interparliamentary Assembly. It's a union of 189 parliaments, I don't know, all parliaments of the world here. And we had meetings with such interesting countries as East Timor. They're inside Indonesia, but they are like Western countries. They speak Portuguese, they're Catholic, and they're more close to Western world than Indonesia. And we were very grateful for them, because they tell us that the first day of full-scale invasion, on 27th of February, they collected $1 million from the small country and sent to us like humanitarian aid. And after all our communication with them, it were 3 times. I met with president, I met with colleague from parliament. They joined to Crimea Platform this year. It was first country from ASEAN region that joined Crimea Platform. Of course, it's not only my result, it's result of president, of Andrei, of all together, of all our team, but it works. Also, we have example of Cambodia, who abstained first time, but now in favor for Ukraine, but of support of our partners, of course, because it was comprehensive case in ASEAN, etc., etc. I think our common object, this map on the right side of the room, when we leave the room, we have map outside, not here, outside. Like it's map like culture project. It's not like map. It's like it's installation. Yeah. I think we need to make this map more in favor to Ukraine. It's possible, but it's very hard job, step by step, country by country, leader by leader, meeting by meeting, on all levels, government, parliamentarians, business, all together, and in all common strategy to promote, to inform, to involve, to take something, to understand their needs, because it's also issue what they want, and etc. Thank you.
Niall Ferguson, give us your historical overview. How should we think about this issue of how to appeal or why there are these large countries? And there's one thing, Oleksandr, I'd point out, that if you're talking about the largest ones, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, these are all democracies. They are all some way or the other in the neutral zone.
Well, I did the math that you alluded to earlier, Fareed, so you wouldn't have to. 39 countries are in some way or another actively supporting Ukraine. So that's maybe a fifth of the world's countries. The good news is that's like 59% of global GDP. Yay. It's 15% of the global population. The top 16 countries that support Ukraine do nearly all of the support. If you're a fan of the Ukraine support tracker, you'll notice that there's a long tail. There's a power law. Most of the support comes from a very small number of countries. If you just look at the top 16, all of whom have given more than $1 billion, you're looking at 11% of the world's population. That's who's supporting Ukraine. And that leaves, you can do the arithmetic, 89% of the world's population whose governments are not supporting. And in the case, of course, of China, the government is supporting Russia in a whole variety of different ways that stop just short of summoning up the secondary sanctions that the United States might impose. So what is going on here? this must be the question that every Ukrainian asked at that first General Assembly vote. Isn't this good guys, bad guys, the most straightforward of political problems? I think the answer is as follows. For the rest of the world, I don't like the global south. We were discussing earlier that it's not a helpful term. But let's just call it the rest of the world that isn't instinctively on the side of Ukraine. It can sometimes feel like we're in Cold War II. There's the United States on one side, now it's China on the other side. And if you are in Africa, if you're in South America, if you're in many parts of Asia, you remember how that all played out when it was the Soviet Union on the other side. A lot of what makes this Cold War different is the massive economic appeal of China, which didn't really exist in the case of the first Cold War, where you were essentially making an ideological appeal from the Soviet Union to the then Third World. That was the phrase we used then, which was in fact equally unhelpful. And I think this explains a part of what's going on. In this Cold War, there are a lot of countries that want to be non-aligned, a lot more that were non-aligned in the first Cold War. And it makes sense, because let's just take a few cases. If you're Brazil, China's your #1 trading partner. You think of that before you start making decisions about geopolitics. Why is Lula swanning around Shanghai and Beijing the other day, visiting the Huawei factory and giving a somewhat naive speech about the need for a BRICS currency? Self-interest.
But can I just ask you to expand on that, Neil? Because Lula, to take your example, you know, at the BRICS summit said, Ukraine is in a Cold War mentality. It needs to compromise, sue for peace, concede territory. This is all directed at Ukraine versus Russia. I understand the China piece that you're describing. Is it your contention that they are all sitting on the sidelines because they fear taking Ukraine's side would anger China? Is it that?
It's not just that. There are a couple other things going on. I'll be really quick. There's the problem that Russia is not only interfering in Ukrainian affairs. Russia's all over Africa. Prigozhin may be dead. Wagner's not dead. Wagner's active in multiple African countries. You don't want to mess with those people because they can off you. They can off your government. That isn't gone because Prigozhin's dead. What's happening is that Putin and Shoigu are taking over Wagner to carry on a pretty profitable protection racket. You're dealing with a mafia state. Guess what? It's a global mafia state. Ukraine is only the biggest operation right now. Let me give you another example. Ever wondered why Israel is not supportive of Ukraine? I asked the former head of Mossad, just explain that to me. He said, I'll tell you why. The Russians put in Syria an air defense system that tracks every Israeli plane that takes off. What are we going to do? So I think we need to recognize that there are practical reasons why so many countries want to be on the fence, non-aligned. Let me add one or maybe just a couple very brief points. History matters here. If we are in some new version of the Cold War and Ukraine is on the side of the United States and its allies, there are a lot of places in the rest of the world that are like, well, in that case, we should probably be on the other side. That's like the knee-jerk response in a lot of countries, particularly on the political left. It's like, the latest American project. No problem guessing how this all ends. And I think that's another reason people have historical memories that are relevant here, and we forget that. Mike, you'll agree with me. We in the United States are the United States of amnesia. We kind of forget that, we were discussing this last night at the nightcap, President George W. Bush also had some experience in the country invading department 20 years ago. Last point, there are other wars in the world. There was a bigger war last year that killed more people in Ethiopia. There's a war going on right now in Sudan, a civil war. I love you. I love Ukraine. I want you guys to win this war. Bad news, you're not the only war in town. And for many parts of the world, this is not, therefore, the proximate problem. And I think that's why you have a hard time in your hands. Good luck getting the East Timorese on your side. Well done. Not going to make any difference to the outcome of this war, I hate to tell you.
All right. Comfort, you are the CEO and president of the International Crisis Group, which I always thought you have better people on the ground than almost any organization I know. You work in all over the world. What are your reflections on this question?
I think Neil spoke on my behalf by what you just said at the end. But let me start by saying that, I mean, as you rightly point out, you know, our presence on the ground allows us to understand it from the perspective and the lived experience of those actors on the ground. But it's not just understanding the lived experience, but trying to come up with policy options. And sometimes those policy options are controversial because we're asking you to take a leap that sometimes looks like compromise as well. In terms of what Ukraine means, as I said it yesterday and I'll say it again today, for an organization whose entire work is about conflict prevention, we have taken a position that in a sense contradicts that, which is full-on support for Ukraine, no question marks about that. But we've also been very careful about warning about the dangers of escalation, because this is, you know, Ukraine's allies, some of them nuclear powers, versus a nuclear power as well. So recognizing the dangers of escalation, but we've been very clear in our position. However, there is this narrative out there that the rest of the world is not supporting Ukraine, and I think that's an unfortunate misunderstanding and misreading. I also, by the way, some of us were looking around at a picture that was going up here about countries that were Russia-leaning, that were supporting Russia. Again, I think it's unfortunate when you simplify complexity. I don't think it helps in a situation that's already difficult to misrepresent, to misunderstand, or not to understand where a country is coming from. That's number one lesson that I've taken away from this. But the other lesson, and it's really unfortunate that it's on the altar of Ukraine that a number of difficult lessons from the past are being navigated and are being addressed. It's unfortunate that it's through the Ukraine lens that a number of countries and people, Farid, and I'm glad you underlined it, that we distinguish between people and their governments. If you did a survey of the people, you'll find that the people in those governments that appear to be on the side of Russia are actually pro what is happening in Ukraine. And I think it's important that you underline that. But it also speaks to 30 or 40 years of West's own mistakes, of intervention, of double standards, of hypocrisy, that we are where we are today. It's not about Ukraine, but it's about the West, but it's also about China, and it's also about Russia. I want to qualify what you said, Niall. Sometimes we overestimate or we overstate Russia's influence in Africa. There are only a handful of countries, and even those countries, those regimes, and I want to underline regimes, are in survival mode as well. And they're looking for ways out to address their own survival or to deal with insecurity where the West has failed. A good example is in the Sahel countries. This is an indictment of France as well as anything else. It's not about Russia, it's an indictment of 8 years of French intervention, where in 8 years, jihadi groups became more agile, more mobile, more able to fight against the French forces. Russia exploited that. Russia saw an opportunity and leaned in there. But it's not the answer for the Sahel, for example. It's not a magic bullet, because Russia will face the same problems as well. So this is also about failure of the West, but also, and it's less about Russia in Africa, because in effect, when you see what is happening on Russia, it's very opportunistic. Some of it is tied to regime survival, and some of it will not last. It's actually pretty fragile. It also speaks to, and one of the things that I think it's worth highlighting today, it was announced that the African Union is finally at the G20. I have to say, when you step back, and it's a very unfortunate thing that I have to say, when you step back a little bit, a number of things that we've been fighting for a last decade or so, a robust, a more honest conversation about reform of multilateral organizations, a more equitable debate about reform of international institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank. The idea today that the AU is part of the G20 is also as a result of what's happening in Ukraine, because suddenly we came out of COVID, we've come out in the climate change conversation and Ukraine, and what are the underlying themes, Fareed, in that conversation? It's about inclusion, it's about equity, it's about recognition, it's about identity, it's about sameness, it's about recognizing that it's not just you who's entitled to be at the table after 50 years, it's also me as a country, as South Africa, as Brazil, as others. And it's because of Ukraine. It's unfortunate that it's because of Ukraine that we're able to address these issues about inclusion and inclusivity. And it's unfortunate this is the route in to get there. So it's a wake-up call for the West. It's a wake-up call about how we run multilateral agencies. It's a wake-up call about the future of international institutions. And I think in a sense, Fareed, it's come home to roost to the West. And I underline it's unfortunate that it's taken a war in Europe to get us to address some of these big fundamental unevenness in the international system. And it's an unfortunate price to pay for us to address some of those mishaps, some of those unevenness and untidiness in the international system, that's why we are where we are today. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned something that we haven't talked a lot about in this setting, but it is a striking thing that's happening in the world, which is we now have had the 8th coup in Africa along essentially a kind of a coup belt in the Sahel. All of them being former French colonies. And in all of those cases, the Russians have presented them on the side of the anti-French. Often it's just 3 colonels who are essentially enacting a coup, but they say we're anti-French, we're anti-colonial. The Russians, Wagner has come on their side, and it works. You see, as far as one can tell, but there are crowds out there. The legacy of colonialism is deeper than people realize. This is one thing that, we're going to go next to India, but I often tell people, just remember that, India has a long memory of when it thinks about the West, it thinks about 250 years of British rule. When it thinks about free trade, it thinks about the fact that it was colonized not by a country, but by a multinational corporation, the East India Company. It was ruled for 100 years by a company. And so, Neil's point is exactly right. In America, when you want to be dismissive of something, you say, that's history. When you want to dismiss somebody as being, over and done with, you say, your history. It's the most derisive thing you can say to bring up history. Well, most countries live with a lot of history in their DNA. Happymon, I want you to bring us some good news, because you've been writing very interesting stuff in Foreign Affairs about India. We've talked a bunch about why India has been, broadly speaking, if not neutral, maybe even tilting slightly toward Russia. But you say this is changing. So explain from your perspective. This is a nice way to take a microcosm of a very important country and explain what's going on.
Thank you, Fareed. I'll sort of jump right into that question. I'll just make 1 or 2 remarks before that. I think this whole framing of democracies versus non-democracies when it comes to the Ukraine question is completely useless. It's unfortunate use, it just doesn't help. Sitting in Delhi, if you say non-democracies are not supporting Ukraine, you say, wait a minute, we are the biggest democracy on planet Earth. So I think countries make decisions on the basis of their national interests. It is important to appreciate those national interests if you want to get through to them. Appreciate where they come from, why they do what they do, rather than calling them names. It just doesn't help. Point number 1. And the second point, I'm a big fan of the Global South. I think the fact that you mentioned, Comfort, there is no equitable global governance. The fact that the global governance has failed in many ways and there is no participation from the Global South will mean that many countries will come together and say, let's talk about Global South. It may look like a trade union, But trade unions do help. I mean, what's wrong with trade unions? They're pretty much working in all parts of the world, including in France. Okay, let me come to the India question, Farid. I think in many ways, geography and geopolitics matter in what states do. You can't take that away from them. So India started out in many ways by looking at this war through the prism of, say, great power politics. It is United States versus Russia in many ways. I think that is changing very quickly. If you go to the think tanks in Delhi, universities in India, there is a recognition that this is an unfortunate war, this is an uncalled for war, and this war must end. I think this is a big change as far as India is concerned. As you know, India doesn't change very fast. India takes decisions very, very slowly. And so from a position that this is someone else's war, to a position that this is a war that must end. I think we've come a very long way. The G20, if you ask me, in my opinion, the latest G20 summit and the communique that just got released in Delhi is a disappointment. But this is not Delhi's doing, right? I mean, there are 19 others present that, including the European Union.
Disappointment because it's a watered-down version from Bali,
Absolutely.
from the last G20 summit.
Absolutely. The Bali Declaration refers to the March 2022 General Assembly resolution, which talks about Russia as the aggressor. This one doesn't even refer to that, even though only some countries sort of agree to that. I think India's position is changing because it is understanding and looking at geopolitics through the prism of its own national interest. Right? For example, the fact that China and Russia are getting closer after the in the wake of the war is something that New Delhi is worried about. So look at India's own relationship with Russia, which I have argued in my Foreign Affairs article, that it is dwindling. India's defense trade with Russia has come down 50% in the last 10 years or 11 years. Now that is a big change. And yet, I think it's a necessity of geopolitical considerations that is forcing India to not completely give up on Russia. You have China, an aggressive China, next door. India's entire, let's say, continental space is going to be dominated by China. And India looked traditionally at Russia as a counter to the Chinese influence in that region. Obviously, that is not going to happen anymore, and hence the Indian change in many ways. Now, come back to the earlier point that you made about what India could potentially do going forward. And I'm a great believer that India must play its cards well in being an arbiter of some kind in this one. Now, not many people would like that. It may be a very unpopular position, but I think all wars need some kind of conversations going on in the background. We had a war with Pakistan in 1999. In the height of the Kargil conflict, there were back-channel conversations that were happening. Now, I think India, given the receptivity that it has in Ukraine and in Russia, will be in a position to play some limited role in terms of bringing the warring parties to the conversation table. To begin with, India, I think India should appoint a special envoy. I think India should put together a peace plan like the others have. Brazil has, China has, and I think India should do that. India should also, for example, encourage the Russians to sort of go back to the Black Sea grain deal, which again the G20 declaration sort of refers to. India should insist with the Russians that tactical nuclear weapons should not be brought to the battlefield. The Russians may not like it, but I think India has a position of not using nuclear weapons. And I think India should also work with countries like Brazil or with Turkey, with IAEA on some of their plans in terms of addressing some of the tactical issues, if not the strategic issues of that kind. My final point, I don't think India will be in a position to bring about a ceasefire or end the war. Clearly, Ukraine will not be in a position to gain anything on the negotiating table what it can't gain on the battlefield. But there are, I think, second-order things that can be achieved by other countries, including India.
Mike McFaul, listening to all this as a former policymaker, where does this leave you when thinking about what could Western policymakers do to change this dynamic, to approach it differently?
So first, Fareed, I feel like I've already talked enough at this conference, so maybe I should just cede my time, or should I say a few things? Just a few things. I have 7 points.
The reason you've been invited to this conference, Mike, is you're a big star. We want to hear more from you.
So I actually was not going to speak, but I have 7 points that I want to make. Pretend there's paragraphs beneath them, okay? But I'm just going to make them really Twitter-like or X-like, or what do we call it? First of all, most of you don't know, but Fareed knows. I wrote my PhD about national liberation movements in Southern Africa, because we've known each other for a long time. And that was a PhD about the collapse of empires, the Portuguese Empire, the British Empire. And the most frustrating thing, I have to say, in my conversations with my friends in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in East Asia, is that my framework for understanding this war as the last gasp of the last Western imperial power, by the way. Russia should be thought of in that way. The last Western imperial power, they gave up 30 years ago, and then they decided, hey, wait a minute, we want to redo. Like, imagine if the British came back to Nigeria 30 years later. Imagine if the Portuguese came back 30 years later after leaving in 1976. That's the way I see this conflict. And by the way, one of the greatest things that the liberal international order did since 45 was decolonization. This is a giant, grotesque return of recolonization, and we haven't won that argument. I've lost that argument 100 times with friends all around the world. Number two, we have to try harder then. And I think what you guys are doing, Jeddah was fantastic success. That the Russians did, okay, little success, okay. But it was the beginning of starting to reframe this thing, bringing people together. By the way, your new Minister of Defense, very useful person on this front. And we, the West, have to get in this game better. We don't have a special envoy. Ambassador Li, he was the ambassador when I was in Russia, the Chinese ambassador. He's out there running around all the time reframing this. We need an ambassador. The EU needs an ambassador. India, special envoy. I think that would be very useful. 3, is the glass half full or half empty? So I used to work on UN debates, right, and getting votes. And in my view, a neutral vote is a positive thing. Because if it's a neutral vote, then we get the sanctions on Iran. We did that in 2010. If it's a neutral vote from Russia and China, then we get UN Security Council Resolution 1970 and 73 to authorize the use of force in Libya. When I look at those votes, I saw 6 votes for Russia. The first time, 7 the last time. Mali, they had to help a coup to get that 7th vote. But is that really half full or half empty? I actually think it's more full than empty because of those 6 votes. That's my 4th point. You said, Neil, what does it matter if East Timor is with them, right? I want to throw that around. What does it matter that these countries are not with Ukraine? What does it matter, these votes? Like, concretely, how does that affect what's going on here? And I think we treat this as like some game that we're watching and who's winning in terms of votes or not. I don't think those neutral votes don't matter that much. I would argue, you tell me if I'm right, to the warriors fighting on the front, I don't think it really matters concretely, either psychologically or materially to them. So let's not overplay, what was it, 89% of the people in the world are against it. Last 3 points really fast. 5th point, I completely agree. War in Iraq, these people are pissed at America. I got it. We got it. But 2 wrongs don't make a right. You cannot be against the invasion of Iraq in one breath and then apologize for Russia's invasion and occupation and annexation of Ukraine. I'm sorry. I'm willing to expect, I was not for that war, just so you know. We don't all think alike in America. But that argument, I don't think works. Last thing, you said this should be about national interest. I'm with you entirely. I believe, as an American, that it is in America's national interest to support democracy, to support freedom. And I think it's a moral thing, but I think it's in our national interest. And so when I hear this frame, it's just in our national interest, remember that we, at least me, I'm not going to speak, Ambassador Brink's here, she can speak for the Biden administration, but I actually think that is useful for us because in the ideological struggle with China that Neil talked about, when you think about our pluses and minuses, we got a lot of minuses, but one plus we do have is this ideological dimension. That is important to our national interests. This false notion that there's realism and ideals, I completely disagree with. Last point. You want to know how to get more votes? You want to know how to change that? Win. If Ukraine wins, suddenly all these fence sitters are going to be leaning just a little bit more to the liberal democratic world. So that, if you really care about those votes, help Ukraine win, and we'll get better votes in the UN General Assembly.
Mike, your practice at Twitter has gotten you very good because you are, in fact, very precise.
Do we have a right to?
Yeah, please come.
Do we have a right to reply from down this end? Because I don't think either of us put the Iraq issue on the table. It's part of the listing that some of these governments give, but we don't put it. Neither of us raised it.
Neil raised it, just to be clear.
Okay.
I wasn't. Yeah,
Okay,
Neil raised it.
You can make your own argument.
Americans are very sensitive about Iraq.
Yeah, but Neil, are you American or British or Scottish? Which one are you today?
All of the above.
Okay, right. As a Scot, and the Scots want national.
As an English person, you should call him Neil, not Niall.
Yeah, Niall. And I'll go with the West Lothian question. I do want to just underline one issue on the question of aggression or principles. Regardless of the vote that took place last March, I mean, whatever happened in New York, that's what happened in New York versus what happens in the capitals of these countries. But one thing that was never up for debate, and I really want to underline this, is that none of these countries that are neutral, and I think we need to take them seriously as well, and I'll come back to that, but none of these countries are putting these principles on the table and are asking for a review of these tables, because what is the one thing that they share with Ukraine is that they were all colonized. The African continent, Latin America, benefits with the principles of the United Nations. It was Kenya's ambassador that defended multilateralism on the eve of the invasion. He defended every single principle of the United Nations. It's impossible that these countries that were colonized will now seek to undermine the very principle for which they exist. To question the aggression, to not defend non-aggression, to not defend integrity and sovereignty, is then to reverse the 50 years of independence, the 60 years of independence. And I want to repeat another thing. We spend a lot of time looking at the countries that abstained or went neutral. And I suspect that we're disappointed with one or two of them, the ones that we consider very important today. For example, South Africa. Nigeria did not abstain. Ghana did not abstain. These are important countries as well. And we should never forget that. I put that listing up again. That list does a disservice to the complexity of the issue. These are important countries as well, and we have to talk to these countries and understand their position. There isn't one country that represents the 54 countries on the continent. And the same with Latin America. And you have to meet these countries where they are. You have to engage them on their priorities. Fareed, you asked a question at the beginning, and we need to answer it. How do you approach this differently? You meet those countries where they are, and you tackle their priorities where they are. So Biden learned that lesson, and when he invited Lula to Washington, he started with Lula's issues, environmental challenges, climate challenges. You do not go to Colombia and ask Colombia to give arms to Ukraine. But what you do is you tell Colombia and Brazil, do not sell arms to Russia, because that would be inconsistent with your own foreign policy. That will be inconsistent with your own left-leaning strategy. as well. You meet those countries where they are, and I think it's important to take that really seriously. These countries want to be considered as serious actors. How you approach this differently, Farid, is also, you say to them, then how do you become responsible actors? If you're going to put a peace proposal on the table, then how do you ensure and guarantee that Ukraine's sovereignty remains intact in the context of your peace proposal? That is where you meet these countries.
I want to get another Ukrainian voice in.
Can I add some remarks?
Something
two small remarks.
Okay,
First of all, about win. Maybe it's like some insight, but what we felt after very successful deliberate of Kherson and Kharkiv region in terms of Middle East, in terms of Sahel and some Maghreb countries, they start to believe in Ukraine much more because they historically and culturally support winners. It's some part of culture. And second remark about digitals. Digits, about amounts. I think it's part of Russian propaganda to take some amount of population, to put it in some very interesting infographic, and say it 60% of population of the world or 80% of population of the world don't support Ukraine, etc., etc. I won't give you one very clear information. About 1.75% of the population of the world will never support Ukraine because it's population of Russian Federation. Okay? If you start... Yeah, no, okay, in close future. If we start to talk about some digits, it's all time who have engineering education like we with Victor, you know what I tell about. It's all time way to manipulation.
Let's get another Ukrainian voice in. Olyana, you're also a member of parliament. Give us your perspective on all this.
Thank you so much. This is actually the best panel for me, guys, in practical terms of my work and of what we do together with Vice Speaker Oleksandr. I'm a member of parliament and member of the delegation to African countries, Middle East, and some other countries of the rest of the world, which Oleksandr heads. And we have an inside chart or live spreadsheet to work with our delegation where we actually track the position of those countries live pretty much, and not just the official position in the UN votes or in the votes of the IPU or in the votes of others, but also the declarations of countries' leaders, the population if we have the polls, etc., etc. And I think it's actually every voice matters and every even small country matter for us very much because of the when the Russian propaganda feels weaker and even one person in the room, one decision maker, one banker from South Africa or other countries is on our side, it's a huge change in the region actually. So I looked at the list of countries that changed their opinion from being against or always leaving the room to being for just in the past 4 to 6 months. And there are not a lot of countries, but they are important countries. So in the UN and other institutions, it was Morocco, Gabon, Madagascar, Iraq, South Sudan, Grenada, and actually Mali, which was here wrongly on the Russian side. They are becoming much more neutral and they are moving on the other side. And Oleksandr is working on that personally, actually, together with us. And in the parliamentary union, the countries are who changed in favor of Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. Mauritius, Uganda, Tanzania is starting to move. Zambia, Brazil, Mexico, Paraguay, Suriname, Malaysia, Pakistan, and Thailand. It doesn't look like a huge list of countries in 6 months, but if you look population-wide, and I counted the population, it's more than, it's almost 800 million people, whereas the government officially changed the position. And it's the work of all of us, of administration of the president, of parliamentary delegations, opening the embassies in Africa, which were never there, and we never had a possibility to open them up. And it makes a huge difference in the region. Just the last thing I'm going to say, Neil told a lot about that. What we are feeling when we are talking to Africans specifically and Middle East, we are feeling that they live in this mentality of Cold War, where Soviet Union is Russia, and Russia is the only deterrent to the capitalism, so-called global extractive capitalism of the US. And I was shocked when I've heard that, in the modern world, but Russia is playing so skillfully on this, on this pain and on this colonial past, and Russia is picturing Ukraine as a playground between Russia and the US. So African journalists are coming to us and saying, we're so sorry for you guys, it's not your fault, you've been played. And it takes so much time to explain to them the reality. And the last point, we talked and we had a delegation from African journalists from 8 different countries. It was Natalia Gumenyuk, who is here, who brought them to Ukraine for the first time. Yeah. It was 8 top African bloggers and journalists. And when they came to us, they told us in private that even the fact that we are in Kyiv, when we make a post that we are in Kyiv, without any comments, just in Kyiv, we lose about 25% of our audience. And we get about 25% of hate speech in Twitter, in every social media, because we are kind of supporting the US. And this is not true. And to fight this narrative and to speak to them and to share the personal stories, to show them the ports of actually Nikolaev and other where the grain deal was done. It makes a huge change. And they have to have the right to be at the table. We've talked so much about the reform of the UN Security Council. It's not happening, but the Ukrainian horrible war is actually the chance to change those global perception of institutions, and they should have the right at the table. And I think that we should do it now or never. Now is the time to do that. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to close this panel with a little good news in my view, the glass half full, as Mike was saying. If you compare this coalition to the coalition that won the Cold War, this is much, much larger. The United States won the Cold War with 14 countries in Western Europe, a couple of countries in Asia, a few island city-states in Southeast Asia, Singapore. The vast majority of the world was non-aligned. Okay, so the thing Ukraine should keep in mind is you have the richest, most technologically powerful, most financially powerful, most militarily powerful countries in the world, with one exception, China, on your side. You also have what I think is very powerful, which is you're on the right side. You have values on your side, and that's why I think Tori Newland's point about fighting this fight in the name of the rules of of a rule-based international order, on behalf of democracy, on behalf of freedom, does make a difference. I think Happymon would agree with me. Indians are moved by this. A lot of what Indians take pride from is the fact that they're the largest democracy in the world, and it is a matter of awkwardness to be the largest democracy in the world, helping an axis of China and Russia if you are seen as doing that. South Africans take enormous pride in the South African Revolution and the fact that it's a values-based country. The South African Constitution is one of the great models of the modern world. So all these things matter. Michael is right. Winning matters more than anything else. But I think Ukrainians shouldn't worry too much. You should try your best, and I commend all these efforts that you're making to get these various countries in Africa to change their votes. At the end of the day, you are on the right side, and what history tells us is that you will win. Oh, wait, I have one thing to tell you. 6 o'clock back here.